For thousands of years, the greatest empires on Earth kept making the same fatal mistake, again and again and again. They looked at the rugged mountains and endless deserts of the Iranian plateau and believed the same thing every conqueror believes. This civilization can be erased. They arrived with armies that had crushed nations far stronger than anything they expected to find here. They came with bronze spears, iron swords, siege engines, cavalry, and the absolute confidence that history itself was on their side. But history had a strange habit on this land, because Iran was never truly defeated. The invaders came believing they would wipe Persia from the map forever. Instead, Persia slowly rewrote them. The first to try were the armies of the ancient world. Massive imperial forces that had already conquered half the known world marched into these lands, expecting another easy victory. Later came the disciplined legions of mighty empires that believed nothing on earth could stop them. After them came warriors fighting under the banner of a powerful new religion sweeping across continents. And then came something even worse from the endless Eurasian steppe. Storms of horsemen appeared like a nightmare from the horizon. Riders who burned cities, slaughtered populations, and left behind towers built from human skulls. Their leader's name would terrify entire civilizations, Genghis Khan. Where the Mongols went, cultures vanished forever. Cities that had existed for thousands of years were erased in days. Entire civilizations dissolved into the dust of history. The Babylonians disappeared. The Hittites vanished. The Assyrians were swallowed by time. Normally, when a civilization suffers invasion, its culture slowly fades away. Languages disappear. Traditions are forgotten. People merge into the cultures of their conquerors. Eventually, the original civilization simply stops existing. History moves on, but Iran refused to follow that rule. Something extremely unusual happened here. Time, after brutal defeats, after capitals were burned, after foreign kings took the throne, the conquerors began to change. Not immediately. First they ruled with iron fists, but then something subtle started happening that a generation would pass. Then another. The invaders would begin speaking Persian. Their courts would start adopting Persian customs. Their architects would begin building in Persian style. Their rulers would wear Persian robes. Their poets would write in the Persian language. Their governments would copy Persian administration. Their children would grow up thinking of themselves not as conquerors, but as kings of Iran. Again and again, the same thing happened. The conquerors arrived as outsiders, but eventually they became Persian. It was as if the civilization itself had a strange gravitational pull, an invisible cultural force powerful enough to bend even its enemies into its orbit. Empires thought they were conquering Iran, in reality, Iran was slowly conquering them. This strange pattern has repeated for more than 5,000 years, and it raises a fascinating question. How did one civilization survive everything that destroyed so many others? How did Iran absorb Macedonians, Romans, Arabs, Mongols, Turks, and still remain unmistakably itself? How did a culture that lost countless wars somehow win the long battle of history? And perhaps the most surprising question of all, how did the same civilization that ruled the ancient world as Persia suddenly decide one day to abandon that legendary name and demand that the entire world call it something else? Iran, to understand this mystery, we have to travel very far back, far earlier than the Persian Empire, earlier than the Greeks, earlier than Rome, earlier even than Babylon. Because the story of Iran does not begin with kings or empires that begins tens of thousands of years ago, when the first humans were trying to survive in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. Long before written history, before cities, before agriculture, before civilization itself, these lands were already shaping the destiny of humanity. Roughly 50,000 years ago, the Iranian plateau was dominated by a different type of human. Neanderthals, they lived in caves, scattered across the mountains of what is now western Iran, hunting wild animals across cold steppes and rocky valleys. But slowly, another species arrived. Our species, the Cro-Magnon humans. Around 36,000 years ago, They began replacing the Neanderthals across the region. And no one knows exactly how the transition happened. Perhaps there were battles. Perhaps they simply outcompete them. But eventually the Neanderthals disappeared and modern humans inherited the land for tens of thousands of years after. That the Iranian plateau remained a harsh and unforgiving world. Jagged mountains, dry deserts, unpredictable rivers. But these conditions created something important. Anyone who survived here had to become extremely resilient. And resilience would become one of the defining traits of Iranian civilization. Because long before Persia became an empire, it was already learning how to endure. Then something extraordinary happened. Around 7,000 years ago, the first signs of urban life began appearing across the Iranian plateau. Archaeologists have discovered settlements that look remarkably like early cities. Places where humans were no longer just surviving. They were organizing, building, creating culture. Point one of the most mysterious of these ancient civilizations emerged in southeastern Iran, that a culture known today as Zoroastrian. For decades, historians believe the first great civilizations of humanity were limited to Mesopotamia and Egypt, but discoveries in Iran began challenging that belief. Zoroastrian. Archaeologists uncovered intricately carved stone vessels, complex artistic designs, and evidence of a highly sophisticated society dating back to the 4th millennium BC, at roughly the same time that early cities were rising along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Another civilization was quietly developing just to the east, which means the Iranian plateau was not a cultural backwater. That it was one of the cradles of civilization itself. And from these early societies, the first true power of ancient Iran would soon emerge, that a kingdom strong enough to challenge the greatest civilizations of its time, that a kingdom whose capital would stand in a city called Susa, a kingdom known as Elam. And in the next part of this story, we will see how this forgotten empire helped create one of the most important inventions in human history, the very first international treaty ever written, and why the land of Iran was already shaping world diplomacy 4,000 years ago, long before the word Persia ever existed. Long before the rise of the famous Persian kings, another civilization ruled the southwestern lands of the Iranian plateau, a civilization powerful enough to challenge the earliest empires of humanity. Its name was Elam. Its capital stood in a city that would remain important for thousands of years, Susa. If you had traveled there around 4,000 years ago, you would not have found a small tribal settlement. You would have found a thriving political center filled with temples, merchants, administrators, and scribes carefully recording the affairs of the state. Elam was not some forgotten corner of the ancient world. It stood directly beside one of humanity's earliest powerhouses, Mesopotamia, and the two regions were locked in a constant, complicated relationship. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they cooperated, but very often they fought. The Sumerians, the people who built the first cities of Mesopotamia, quickly learned that their neighbors to the east were not weak. The Elamites were organized, they were ambitious, and they were dangerous. By the 26th century BC, Elam had become powerful enough to project its influence deep into Mesopotamia itself. At times, Elamite kings even dictated terms to the rulers of Sumer. Imagine that for a moment. One of the earliest civilizations in human history, challenging another one of the earliest civilizations in human history. Two cradles of civilization staring at each other across a frontier that would remain important for thousands of years. But the most fascinating moment in this rivalry came in the 23rd century BC. At that time, Mesopotamia was dominated by a new and rising superpower, the Achaemenid Empire, led by powerful rulers who dreamed of uniting the entire region under their control. One of those rulers was a king named Naram-Sin. That Naram-Sin was not a cautious man. He was an ambitious conqueror who believed the Achaemenid Empire should dominate everything around it. And naturally, that included Elam. War came. Akkadian armies marched east toward the Iranian plateau. Elamite forces met them on the battlefield. For most of ancient history, wars like this ended in very simple ways. One side was crushed, cities were destroyed, populations were enslaved, empires expanded. That was how the ancient world normally worked. But what happened next was something different. Instead of total destruction, the two sides negotiated. And more importantly, they wrote it down. The agreement between Naram-Sin and the Elamites became something incredibly rare for that time, that a formal written treaty. Think about that for a second. 4,000 years ago, two rival powers fought a war, then sat down and created a written diplomatic agreement defining their relationship. The treaty guaranteed that Elam would remain independent. But there was a condition that Elam's foreign policy had to align with Akkadian interests that, in simple terms, Elam stayed free, as long as it stayed politically loyal to it. May sound ordinary today. But this moment was revolutionary, because it represents one of the earliest known international treaties in human history. Diplomacy, negotiation, formal agreements between states, all concepts that would shape world politics for thousands of years. And one of the earliest examples happened right here in the Iranian world. From the very beginning, the Iranian plateau was not just a battlefield. It was also a place where civilizations experimented with ideas that would influence the entire planet. But while Elam was rising and negotiating with powerful neighbors, another transformation was slowly approaching. Migration, a movement of people that would completely change the identity of the region. Because the people we call Iranians today were not originally from this land. They came from far away, from the vast grasslands stretching across Central Asia and the Caucasus. Somewhere between 2000 BC and 1500 BC, waves of nomadic tribes began moving south toward the Iranian plateau. They were not city builders at first. They were horse-riding pastoralists, mobile, flexible, used to surviving harsh environments. And they belonged to one of the largest language families on Earth, the Indo-European family. The same linguistic family that would later produce Latin, Greek, Germanic languages, and eventually modern languages like English, Spanish, French, and German. But these tribes were part of a special branch of that family, the Indo-Iranian branch. Their languages carried echoes that can still be heard today, words that shared roots with European languages thousands of miles away. When these tribes arrived on the Iranian plateau, they did not wipe out the earlier populations like the Elamites. Instead, they mixed with them. Cultures blended, traditions merged, and from that fusion, a new identity slowly began to emerge. These newcomers had a word they used to describe themselves, a word that meant something very specific, that it meant noble. They called themselves Arya. The word had nothing to do with the twisted political meanings it would gain thousands of years later to these ancient tribes. It simply meant people who belonged to their cultural group, the noble people, the insiders. And when they looked at their new homeland, they gave it a name that would echo across thousands of years. They called the land Iranian, the land of the Aryans. Over centuries, the pronunciation slowly changed. Languages evolved, dialects shifted, until eventually that ancient word transformed into a familiar name, Iran. But at this stage in the story, Iran was not yet an empire. It was a landscape filled with tribes and growing alliances. Among these groups, two would eventually become the most powerful related peoples who would shape the future of the region, the Medes and the Persians. But before either of them built their empires, before the famous Persian kings rose to power, something even more important happened on the Iranian plateau. Something that would influence not just politics, but the way humans understand the entire universe. Because here, in these mountains and deserts, a revolutionary idea was born, an idea about the nature of good and evil, an idea about light and darkness. And most importantly, an idea about time itself, a religion unlike anything the world had seen before, that a belief system that would shape Judaism, influence Christianity, and leave echoes in Islam, that it began with the teachings of a mysterious prophet, that a man named Zarathustra. And in the next part of our story, we will see how his ideas transformed the Iranian people into something extraordinary, that a civilization that believed it was fighting not just political enemies, but a cosmic war between light and darkness, that a belief powerful enough to unite an entire nation. and powerful enough to change how humanity thinks about the beginning and the end of time. By the time the Indo-Iranian tribes had settled across the Iranian plateau, the land had already become a crossroads of cultures. Ancient Elamite traditions still echoed through old cities. Nomadic tribal customs shaped everyday life. New languages were forming. New alliances were emerging. But the most powerful weapon this civilization would ever create was not forged from metal. That it was not a sword, not a spear, not even an army. That it was an idea. Somewhere on the Iranian plateau, sometime perhaps around the second millennium BC, a man appeared whose teachings would change the way millions of people understood existence itself. His name was Zarathustra. The Greeks would later call him Zoroaster. Very little is known about his life with certainty. Historians still debate when exactly he lived. Some believe he walked the earth around 1500 BC. Others argue it may have been closer to 1000 BC. But regardless of the exact date, the ideas he introduced were revolutionary. Because until that moment, most ancient religions saw the world in cycles. Life followed the rhythm of nature. The sun rose. The sun set. Seasons repeated. Empires rose and fell. Everything moved in circles. But Zarathustra looked at the universe differently. He taught that existence was a cosmic battlefield, that a war between two fundamental forces. That on one side stood Ahura Mazda, the god of light, truth, wisdom, order, creation, everything that brought harmony to the universe. That on the other side stood Ungra Mainyu, also known as Ahriman, the spirit of darkness. That chaos, that lies, that corruption, that destruction. That in Zarathustra's vision, the universe was not neutral. That it was not random. That it was a struggle between good and evil, and humanity was not just watching that struggle. Human beings were participants. Every action, every word, every decision helped one side or the other. Truth strengthened the forces of light. Lies strengthened the forces of darkness. Good thoughts, good words, good deeds. These are not just moral guidelines. They were weapons in a cosmic war. This idea spread through Iranian society with incredible power because it gave meaning to everything. Farmers growing crops were defending order against chaos. Warriors defending their homeland were fighting for the forces of light. Kings ruling justly were helping maintain the divine balance of the world. But Zarathustra introduced another idea that may have been even more influential, something that would later shape three of the world's largest religions. For the first time in history, time itself was described as linear. According to Zoroastrian belief, the universe had a beginning, creation, and it would eventually have an end. That a final moment when the war between light and darkness would reach its ultimate conclusion. The end of time, there would be a great battle. The forces of good would defeat evil forever. The world would be purified. There would be a final judgment, and humanity would face the consequences of its actions. Today, these ideas may sound familiar. Heaven, hell, judgment, the end of the world. But when Zarathustra introduced them, they were something completely new, and their influence would travel far beyond Iran, because centuries later, the Persian Empire would conquer Babylon, and inside Babylon lived a people who had been taken there as captives, the Jews. For decades they had lived far from their homeland, but when the Persian king conquered the city, something unexpected happened. Instead of enslaving them, he freed them, and during the long period when the Jewish people lived under Persian rule, cultural ideas flowed between the two civilizations. Jewish scholars encountered Zoroastrian concepts, ideas about angels, demons, final judgment, that a messianic savior, the end of time. Over generations, some of these ideas began appearing inside Jewish religious thought, and from Judaism, they would later influence Christianity and later still Islam. Which means a religion born on the Iranian plateau may have helped shape the way billions of people today imagine the fate of the universe. Even famous philosophers noticed this. The German thinker Friedrich Nietzsche once acknowledged that Zarathustra represented one of the earliest thinkers to frame existence as a struggle between moral forces. The idea of good versus evil as a defining feature of human life traces some of its roots back to ancient Iran. And for the people living on the Iranian plateau, these beliefs created something extremely powerful. Unity, because if your civilization believes, it is literally fighting on the side of cosmic light, defending order against chaos, then survival becomes more than political, the IT becomes sacred. This mindset helped shape the identity of the early Iranian tribes. And as those tribes continued growing stronger, two groups slowly rose above the others, two peoples who would dominate the political future of the region: the Medes and the Persians. They were cousins. Both descended from the Indo-Iranian migrations. Both spoke related languages. Both shared cultural traditions. But history would eventually place them on different paths. T first. It was the Medes who rose to power. Around 670 BC, they formed the first major Iranian state, a kingdom strong enough to challenge one of the most terrifying empires the world had ever seen: the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire had dominated the Middle East for centuries through sheer brutality. They destroyed cities, deported entire populations, and ruled through fear. But when the Medes allied with the Babylonians, they managed to do something almost unimaginable. They destroyed the Assyrian Empire. The great Assyrian capital Nineveh fell in 612 BC. One of the most feared empires in history collapsed. And suddenly, the Medes stood among the major powers of the ancient world. But their moment at the top did not last very long, because history had another surprise waiting. The Medes had powerful relatives living to the south. Relatives who would soon produce one of the most remarkable leaders in world history, a man who would unite the Iranian peoples and build an empire so vast it would become the first true superpower on earth. His name was Cyrus. Later generations would remember him as Cyrus the Great. And in the next part of our story, we will watch how this young Persian prince overthrew the Medes, united the Iranian tribes, and created the empire the world would remember forever as Persia, to be by the middle of the 6th century BC. The Iranian plateau was no longer just a land of tribes and scattered kingdoms. Power had begun concentrating. Armies were growing larger. Kings were thinking bigger. And in the western regions of the plateau, the Medes had already built a powerful kingdom. They ruled vast territories stretching across much of modern Iran. For a time, they were the dominant Iranian power. But history was quietly preparing a new leader, one who would change the balance of power across the entire known world. His name was Cyrus. Later generations would call him Cyrus the Great. What made Cyrus unique was his heritage, that he was born from two worlds. His father was Persian, his mother was Median. That meant he stood between the two strongest Iranian peoples. And in that position, he saw something others did not. The Persians and the Medes were not natural enemies. They were cousins. Their languages were similar. Their cultures overlapped. Their gods were familiar to each other. If someone could unite them, they would form an incredibly powerful force. And Cyrus believed he could be that someone. Around 550 BC, he launched a rebellion against the Median king that at first, the revolt seemed almost impossible. The Medes were stronger, more established, better organized. But Cyrus had something equally powerful: loyal followers who believed in his vision. Battle after battle followed. Eventually, the armies of Cyrus marched directly toward the Median capital. And when the final confrontation came, the Median Empire collapsed. But Cyrus did something unexpected. Instead of destroying the Medes, he united them with the Persians. The two peoples became partners in a new empire. It was a brilliant move, because now Cyrus commanded the combined strength of the entire Iranian world. And he was just getting started. The west lay the wealthy kingdom of Lydia, famous for its gold and powerful armies. Cyrus invaded. The Lydian king was defeated. Next came the Greek cities along the coast of Asia Minor. They too fell under Persian influence. But the greatest prize still remained. One of the most legendary cities on earth. A city whose hanging gardens and towering walls had captured the imagination of the ancient world: Babylon. Babylon had ruled Mesopotamia for centuries. Its walls were considered almost impossible to breach. But Cyrus approached the conquest in a very different way. Instead of destroying the city, he presented himself As a liberator, that Babylon's rulers had become deeply unpopular among many of their own people. When Cyrus arrived, large parts of the population welcomed him. The city fell with surprisingly little resistance. And when Cyrus entered Babylon in 539 BC, he made a decision that would echo through history. He did not sack the city. He did not enslave the population. He did not destroy the temples. Instead, he restored them, that he allowed different peoples inside the empire to continue practicing their own religions, that he allowed deported populations to return to their homelands. Among those people were the Jews, who had been living in captivity in Babylon. Cyrus permitted them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. For this reason, he is remembered in the Hebrew Bible as a chosen instrument of God, a foreign emperor praised for his mercy. This approach to empire was radically different from what many rulers before him had done. Cyrus understood something important. An empire built entirely on fear eventually collapses. But an empire built on cooperation can last much longer. Instead of crushing cultures, he allowed them to exist inside a larger imperial framework. And, as his conquests expanded, that framework grew enormous. By the time Cyrus finished his campaigns, his empire stretched across a breathtaking distance, from Central Asia in the east to Anatolia in the west, from the mountains of Iran to the rich river valleys of Mesopotamia. For the first time in history, a single political structure controlled territories that connected multiple major civilizations. Historians often call it the Achaemenid Empire, but most people simply know it as the Persian Empire, and it was unlike anything the world had seen before. But building a massive empire is one thing. Keeping it stable is something else entirely. After Cyrus died, the challenge of managing this enormous territory fell to his successors. Among them, one ruler stands out above all others, a man who transformed the empire into one of the most efficient governing systems the ancient world had ever seen. His name was Darius. Under Darius, the Persian Empire reached astonishing levels of organization instead of ruling everything from a single center. Darius divided the empire into 20 provinces known as satrapies. Each satrapy was governed by a local administrator called satrap. They collected taxes, maintained order, reported directly to the king. But Darius was careful. He knew power could corrupt. So he created inspectors known as the eyes and ears of the king. These royal agents traveled across the empire, secretly checking on local officials to make sure they were not abusing their authority. IT was an early form of anti-corruption oversight. Darius also introduced a standardized tax system, a unified gold coin known as the daric, and perhaps most impressively, a massive road network connecting the entire empire. The most famous of these roads became known as the Royal Road. It stretched nearly 2,500 kilometers from the Persian heartland to the western edge of the empire. Along this road, messengers carried information with astonishing speed. A relay system of horses allowed royal messages to travel across the empire in days rather than weeks. Greek historian Herodotus once described the Persian postal riders with admiration. He wrote that nothing could stop them. Not snow, not rain, not heat, not darkness. The message would always arrive. Under Darius, nearly 50 million people lived under Persian rule. That moment in history. That may have been almost half the population of the entire planet. The Persian Empire had become the largest and most sophisticated political system humanity had ever created. But even the greatest empires faced danger, because beyond the borders of Persia lived enemies. Some were powerful kingdoms. Others were nomadic tribes from the vast northern steppes. And Cyrus himself would eventually confront one of those tribes, a fierce people living in Central Asia, the Massagetæ. What happened next would become one of the most dramatic moments in ancient history, because during that campaign, the greatest emperor of Persia would meet a brutal and legendary an ending so shocking that historians would repeat the story for thousands of years, a story involving a vengeful queen and a bag filled with blood. And in the next part of our story, we will witness the fall of Cyrus the Great and the beginning of a new chapter in the long struggle that shaped the destiny of Iran. why the time Cyrus the Great stood at the height of his power. The Persian Empire had become something extraordinary, that a political machine stretching across continents, an empire linking dozens of cultures, languages, and religions under one crown. But Cyrus was not the kind of ruler who stayed comfortably behind palace walls. Like many great conquerors of history, he believed the empire had to keep expanding. And beyond Persia's northeastern frontier lived powerful nomadic tribes who constantly raided settled lands. These tribes came from the vast steppes of Central Asia. They were masters of horseback warfare, fast, unpredictable, deadly. Among them was a powerful confederation known as the Massagetes. They lived in a world very different from the cities and bureaucracies of the Persian Empire. Their society was mobile, their warriors were fearless, and their leader was someone history would remember for centuries, that a queen named Timur. At some point around 530 BC, Cyrus launched a campaign against the Massagetes. Exactly why he did so remains debated. Some historians believe he wanted to secure the empire's eastern frontier. Others believe he underestimated the strength of the nomads. Either way, the Persian army marched into dangerous territory. First, Cyrus tried something clever. He set a trap. The Persians left a camp filled with food and wine, luxuries the nomadic warriors rarely experienced. When a group of Massagetes discovered it, they celebrated, they drank, they feasted, and many became intoxicated. Cyrus attacked. The trap worked. A large portion of the Massagetes force was destroyed. Among the dead was the son of Queen Timur. When she heard the news, the queen sent a message to Cyrus. Her warning was simple: withdraw from her lands or face the consequences. Cyrus refused. The two armies met in one of the fiercest battles of the ancient world. The fight was brutal. Steppe cavalry crashed into Persian formations. Archers filled the air with arrows. Warriors fought hand-to-hand across the battlefield. When the dust settled, the Persian army had been shattered. And somewhere in that chaos, Cyrus the Great was killed. For the man who had built the greatest empire on earth, the end came far from the cities he had conquered, far from the palaces he had ruled. Just another fallen warrior on a brutal battlefield. But the story did not end there. According to the ancient historian Herodotus, Queen Timur demanded that Cyrus's body be found. When it was brought before her, she ordered his head to be cut off. Then she had a leather sack filled with human blood. She dropped the severed head into it and spoke words that would echo through history. "You thirsted for blood," she said. "Now drink your fill." Whether the story is completely true or partially legend, it shows something important. Even the greatest conquerors of history can fall, but Cyrus's death did not destroy the Persian Empire. The system he had built was strong enough to survive him, and under the rule of his successors, the empire continued to grow, especially under Darius I, who turned Persia into the most organized superpower the world had ever seen. But no empire expands forever without creating enemies, and soon the Persians would encounter a civilization that would challenge them in ways they had never faced before. The West lay a region filled not with a single kingdom, but dozens of fiercely independent city-states, small compared to Persia, but proud, competitive, and obsessed with freedom. The Greeks first, Persia did not consider them a major threat. They were scattered across islands and coastal cities. They fought each other constantly. Compared to the vast Persian Empire, they looked insignificant, but small. Sparks can start enormous fires. Some Greek cities in Asia Minor had already come under Persian rule. Eventually they revolted. This uprising drew the attention of the mainland Greek cities. Some of them, especially Athens, supported the rebellion. From the Persian perspective, this was unacceptable. Rebellion had to be punished. And so began one of the most famous conflicts in ancient history, the Greco-Persian Wars. The Persian kings launched massive military campaigns toward Greece. Huge armies crossed the Aegean world. Gigantic fleets sailed across the seas. The Persians believed the war would be quick. After all, they had conquered empires far larger than Greece. But Greece had something Persia did not expect: city-states willing to fight desperately for independence, point, one of the most famous moments of this conflict occurred at a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae. There, a small Greek force led by King Leonidas of Sparta attempted to block the path of a much larger Persian army. Later, legends would focus on 300 Spartan warriors who fought to the death. The story became one of the most famous last stands in history in modern Western culture. This moment is often portrayed as a heroic victory over the Persian Empire. But the real story is more complicated. Yes, the Greeks managed to defend their independence. Yes, they won several important battles. But for the enormous Persian Empire, these wars were not catastrophic. They were more like painful but manageable setbacks on the edges of the empire. Losing influence over a few Greek cities did not threaten the survival of Persia, and the Persians were not limited to military strategies. They had another powerful weapon, money. Instead of conquering Greece directly, Persian rulers began funding different Greek city-states, sometimes Athens, sometimes Sparta. The goal was simple: keep the Greeks fighting each other, and it worked. Greek rivalries exploded into devastating internal wars. The most famous of these conflicts was the Peloponnesian War, where Athens and Sparta nearly destroyed each other. Eventually, exhausted and financially drained, the Greek states were forced to accept Persian diplomatic influence. In 387 BC, a treaty known as the King's Peace was signed. It was negotiated under the authority of the Persian king Artaxerxes II, and it effectively made Persia the ultimate power broker in Greek affairs. In other words, the Persians achieved through diplomacy what they had struggled to achieve through war. They became the silent masters behind Greek politics. But while Persia was manipulating the Greek world from afar, a storm was quietly forming in the north, in a rugged land called Macedonia. There, a young king was rising, that a man with enormous ambition, that a man who had studied Greek warfare, Greek philosophy. In Greek politics, that a man who believed he could accomplish something no one had ever done before: conquer the Persian Empire itself. His name was Alexander. And in the next part of our story, we will watch as the unstoppable armies of Alexander the Great crash into Persia, burn one of the most magnificent cities in the ancient world, and nearly bring the long history of Iranian civilization to a dramatic end. Why the 4th century BC. The Persian Empire had ruled much of the known world for more than 200 years. It was still enormous, still wealthy, still powerful. But something had quietly changed. The empire had grown too large. Controlling such a massive territory required strong leadership from the center. A weak king meant slow decisions, internal rivalries, and powerful governors starting to act like independent rulers. And unfortunately for Persia, that moment of weakness arrived at exactly the wrong time. Because far to the northwest, in the mountainous kingdom of Macedonia, a new kind of leader had appeared, a young king raised on stories of heroic conquest, a man trained by one of the greatest philosophers in history, Aristotle. His name was Alexander. Later the world would call him Alexander the Great. From the beginning, Alexander dreamed bigger than the small kingdom he inherited. He looked east, toward the vast Persian Empire. For generations, Greek cities had fought defensive wars against Persian expansion. But Alexander believed the time had come to reverse that story. He would not defend Greece. He would conquer Persia. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed into Asia with an army that, on paper, looked ridiculously small compared to the forces Persia could raise. Roughly 40,000 soldiers against an empire that could mobilize hundreds of thousands. But Alexander's army had something extraordinary. The Macedonian phalanx, a terrifying formation of heavily armed infantry carrying long spears called sarissas, sometimes over 6 meters long. When these soldiers locked shields and lowered their spears, they formed a moving wall of iron points. Combined with highly disciplined cavalry and Alexander's personal leadership on the battlefield, the army became incredibly dangerous. The first major clash came at the Battle of Granicus. Persian forces attempted to stop Alexander near a river crossing, but the Macedonian army broke through. Victory after victory followed. Cities began falling. The Persian defenses started collapsing. Then came the most important confrontation, the Battle of Issus in 333 BC. For the first time, Alexander faced the Persian king himself, Darius III. The battle was chaotic. Dust filled the air. Thousands of soldiers collided in brutal close combat. But Alexander aimed directly at the center of the Persian army. At the king. When Darius saw the Macedonian cavalry racing toward him, panic spread through the Persian command. The king fled the battlefield. And once a king runs, an army usually follows. The Persian forces collapsed. Darius escaped, but the damage was done. Alexander now controlled much of the empire's western territory, but the final confrontation had not yet come. Darius gathered another massive army, point one last attempt to stop the Macedonian invasion. The two forces met, again in 331 BC at the Battle of Gaugamela. This was supposed to be the battle that saved Persia. Darius chose an enormous open battlefield perfect for his large army and war chariots. He may have commanded over 100,000 soldiers. Alexander had far fewer. But once again, strategy defeated numbers. The Macedonian army created a gap in the Persian lines. Alexander saw it instantly that he charged directly toward the king. And just like at Issus, Darius fled. This time, the Persian Empire truly collapsed. Alexander marched deeper into the heart of Persia. City after city surrendered. Treasuries filled with unimaginable wealth fell into his hands. And eventually he arrived at the symbolic heart of the empire, a city whose palaces glittered with gold and precious stones, a city representing the glory of Persian civilization, Persepolis. Persepolis was not just a capital. It was a symbol, but a ceremonial center where kings celebrated their power and unity over the empire. But Alexander wanted to send a message. The Greek world, the Persians, history itself. Point one night, during a massive celebration, something dramatic happened. Perhaps it was drunken arrogance. Perhaps it was calculated revenge for earlier Persian invasions of Greece. Whatever the reason, Alexander gave the order. Burn Persepolis. Flames rose into the night sky. The magnificent palace complex burned. Columns cracked from the heat. Roofs collapsed. Statues shattered. One of the most beautiful cities of the ancient world turned into ruins. For many observers at the time, it looked like the end of Persia. The great empire that had dominated the world for centuries had been crushed, its capital destroyed, its king dead soon afterward while fleeing east, its lands now ruled by a foreign conqueror. Alexander declared himself the new king of Asia. The Persian Empire was gone. Or so it seemed, because something strange began happening almost immediately. Something Alexander himself did not expect. Instead of Persia disappearing, Alexander began changing. Slowly at first. Then more dramatically, he started wearing Persian royal clothing. He adopted Persian court ceremonies. He surrounded himself with Persian advisors and administrators. He even encouraged marriages between his Macedonian officers and Persian noble families. Many of his own Greek and Macedonian soldiers hated this. They believed Alexander was becoming too Persian. But Alexander understood something important. The Persian system worked, its bureaucracy, its administrative structure, its culture of governance. It was too powerful to simply destroy it instead of replacing it. He absorbed it, which is exactly what had happened to so many conquerors before. The Iranian cultural gravity had begun pulling him in. But Alexander's empire would not last long. In 323 BC, at just 32 years old, Alexander died suddenly in Babylon. His generals immediately began fighting over the empire he left behind. And out of that chaos emerged a new state. Point one, ruled by Greek elites, a kingdom called the Seleucid Empire. For a moment in history, it looked like the Iranian world had truly been conquered. Greek language, Greek rulers, Greek culture spreading across the region. But the story was not finished, because deep within the Iranian plateau, something was stirring again. A new power, a new dynasty, a people who would rise from the east and drive the Greeks out. And once again, Iran would do what it had done so many times before. It would absorb the conquerors. In the next part of our story, we will see how the mysterious Parthians emerge from the steppes, defeat the Greeks, and build a powerful empire that will challenge the most dangerous force in the Mediterranean world, the unstoppable legions of Rome. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, his empire instantly began to crack apart. The empire had been held together by one man's ambition, one man's charisma, one man's military brilliance. Without him, it was like removing the keystone from an arch. Everything began collapsing. Alexander's generals, known later as the Diadochi, meaning the successors, started fighting each other for pieces of the enormous territory he had conquered. Battles erupted across the ancient world. Alliances shifted. Cities changed hands repeatedly. From this chaos emerged several new kingdoms. One of them controlled most of the lands that had once belonged to the Persian Empire. It was ruled by a Greek dynasty founded by one of Alexander's generals. This state became known as the Seleucid Empire. For the first time in history, the Iranian plateau was ruled by foreign kings speaking Greek. Greek culture began spreading across the region. Greek cities were founded. Greek became the language of administration in many areas. Statues of Greek gods appeared in places where Zoroastrian fire temples once stood alone. To many observers of the time, it looked like Iranian civilization had finally been absorbed by a foreign culture. It seemed like the Persian world had been replaced. But beneath the surface, something very different was happening. Because while Greek rulers controlled the major cities and trade routes, the deeper heart of Iran was never fully under their control. The mountains, the deserts, the distant eastern provinces, these lands still belonged to Iranian tribes. And one of those tribes would soon rise with incredible force. They were known as the Parthians. Originally, the Parthians were a nomadic Indo-Iranian people living on the northeastern edges of the old Persian territories. They were not famous, they were not wealthy, they were not powerful. But they possessed something extremely dangerous. They were masters of horseback warfare. Their warriors lived on horseback. They could ride for days across the steppe without stopping. They were incredibly skilled archers, and they had perfected a tactic that would terrify enemy armies for centuries, a maneuver that historians later called the Parthian shot. It worked like this. Parthian cavalry would charge toward the enemy, firing arrows. Then suddenly they would turn and appear to retreat. Enemy soldiers, believing they were winning, would chase them. But as the Parthian riders galloped away, they would twist their bodies around on the saddle and fire arrows backward at their pursuers. An army chasing them would suddenly be hit by a deadly rain of arrows from riders who seemed to be fleeing. It was devastating. In around 247 BC, the Parthians began using these skills to challenge Seleucid authority. Their leader was a man named Arsaces. He led a rebellion that slowly carved out territory from the weakened Greek rulers. First, the Seleucid kings tried to crush the uprising, but they had problems everywhere. Revolts in other provinces, wars with rival kingdoms, internal power struggles. The Parthians kept growing stronger. Province after province slipped away from Greek control. Eventually, the Parthians built something remarkable, the new Iranian Empire. Historians call it the Parthian Empire. Its rulers adopted an ancient Persian royal title, King of Kings. It was a deliberate message. They were presenting themselves as the successors to the old Persian empires, and slowly, Greek influence began fading. Persian traditions returned. Iranian culture reasserted itself. Exactly the pattern that had happened before. The conquerors had arrived, but eventually, they were replaced by the culture they tried to dominate. However, the Parthians soon faced a much more dangerous enemy, the West. Another power was rising, a civilization that believed it was destined to rule the world, a republic built on discipline, military organization, and relentless expansion. Rome did it first. The Romans and the Parthians barely noticed each other. Their worlds were far apart. But as both empires expanded, their borders slowly moved closer, until eventually they touched. And once two great empires share a border, conflict becomes almost inevitable. The first major confrontation came in 53 BC that a Roman general named Marcus Licinius Crassus decided to invade Parthian territory. Crassus was not just any commander, he was one of the most powerful men in Rome. Part of the famous First Triumvirate, ruling alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey. But Crassus wanted something more. He wanted military glory. He wanted conquest. He wanted to defeat the Parthians and become one of Rome's greatest heroes. So he marched east with roughly 40,000 Roman soldiers. Legions famous for their discipline and battlefield effectiveness. But the Romans had one major problem. They had never fought an enemy like the Parthians before. The Roman military system was designed for direct confrontation. Infantry lines, heavy shields, close combat. The Parthians fought completely differently. The Battle of Carrhae. Roman legions marched into the desert expecting a conventional battle. Instead, they encountered thousands of Parthian horse archers. The Parthians stayed out of reach, riding in circles around the Roman formations. Arrows rained down constantly, hour after hour. Roman shields became filled with arrows, men collapsed from wounds and exhaustion. Whenever Roman cavalry tried to attack, the Parthians retreated, then turned and fired backward with deadly accuracy. The famous Parthian shot. The Romans were trapped in a nightmare. They could not catch the enemy. They could not escape the arrows. By the end of the battle, the Roman army had been destroyed. Thousands were dead. Thousands more were captured. Crassus himself was killed. According to later Roman writers, the Parthians mocked his greed by pouring molten gold into his mouth after death. Whether true or legend, the story spread across the Roman world. Rome had suffered one of the worst defeats in its history, and the Parthians had proven something remarkable. An Iranian empire could stand against the most powerful military machine in the Mediterranean. For the next 5 centuries, the Parthian Empire would remain one of Rome's greatest rivals. Sometimes they fought, sometimes they negotiated, sometimes they traded, but neither empire could completely defeat the other. It became a long stalemate between two giants of the ancient world. Yet eventually, a new force would rise within Iran itself, a dynasty determined to restore the glory of the ancient Persian kings, a dynasty that would transform Iran into a centralized superpower once again. They would revive Zoroastrianism, rebuild imperial authority, and challenge Rome even more aggressively than the Parthians ever had. They called themselves the Safavids. And in the next part of our story, we will see the rise of the Sasanian Empire, one of the greatest golden ages in Iranian history, and the brutal centuries-long war that would nearly destroy both Iran and Rome forever. For nearly 500 years, the Parthian Empire stood as the great Iranian power. They had defeated Roman legions, controlled vast territories stretching from Mesopotamia deep into Central Asia, and revived the ancient Persian title, King of Kings. But the Parthian system had a weakness. Their empire was loosely organized. Instead of one strong central government, power was shared with powerful noble families who controlled their own territories. These noble houses were loyal most of the time, but loyalty in such a system could quickly turn into rivalry. And as centuries passed, internal conflicts weakened the empire. Local rulers began acting more like independent kings. Authority from the center slowly faded. The Parthian Empire was still large, but it was no longer unified. Then, in the early 3rd century AD, a man appeared in southern Iran who believed the time had come to restore the old Persian greatness. His name was Ardashir. He came from a region known as Persis, the ancient homeland of the original Persian kings, the same land where Cyrus the Great had once begun his rise. Ardashir was ambitious, but more importantly, he was patient. He spent years consolidating power in the south, defeating local rivals, building alliances, strengthening his army. Then, in 224 AD, he challenged the Parthian king directly. The two forces met in a decisive battle. When the fighting ended, the Parthian ruler was dead. The centuries-old Parthian Empire collapsed, and Ardashir proclaimed the birth of a new dynasty, the Sasanian Empire, named after his ancestor Sasan, whose lineage Ardashir proudly claimed. But the Sassanids were not just another dynasty replacing the previous one. They had a much bigger vision. They wanted to rebuild the Persian Empire as a powerful centralized state, something closer to the old empire of Cyrus and Darius. To do that, they made several dramatic changes. First, they strengthened royal authority. Instead of semi-independent nobles ruling provinces, the king tightened control over the administration. Second, they revived one of the oldest cultural pillars of Iranian identity, Zoroastrianism. Under the Safavids, Zoroastrianism became the official state religion. Fire temples were built across the empire. Priests gained enormous influence. Religious texts were collected, standardized, and preserved. The faith that had once inspired the early Iranian tribes was now placed at the very center of the empire's identity. Society itself became highly structured. The population was divided into major classes: priests, warriors, administrators, and common people. Each group had defined roles and responsibilities within the state. That it created a system that resembled a strict but effective meritocracy. Talented individuals could rise within their social class and serve the empire. And the result was remarkable. Within a few generations, the Safavid Empire had become one of the most powerful states on earth. Its cities flourished, trade expanded. Persian art, architecture, and scholarship blossomed. Magnificent palaces rose across the land. Stone reliefs carved into mountains celebrated the victories of Sasanian kings. But there was one problem, a very big problem. Because to the west still stood one of the greatest powers the world had ever known. The Roman Empire. Or more precisely, what remained of it. This time, Rome itself had already transformed. The western half of the empire would eventually collapse, but the eastern half continued as a powerful state centered in Constantinople. Historians call this state the Byzantine Empire, and for the Sasanians, Byzantium was both a rival and an obsession. The two empires stood face to face across the fertile lands of Mesopotamia and the Caucasus, regions rich in resources, trade routes, and strategic importance. Neither side was willing to give them up. The war became almost constant. For nearly 4 centuries, the Sasanians and the Romans, later Byzantines, fought one another again and again. Campaign after campaign, sieges, battles, border raids. Occasional truces that never lasted very long. Some wars ended with Persian victories, others with Roman victories. Cities changed hands multiple times. Entire regions were devastated repeatedly. Yet despite all this bloodshed, neither empire could permanently defeat the other. It was like watching two giants locked in an endless wrestling match, each one powerful enough to injure the other, but not powerful enough to deliver the final blow point. One of the most dramatic moments came under the Sasanian king, Shapur in 260 AD. Shapur defeated a Roman army and captured the Roman Emperor Valerian alive. This was an unprecedented humiliation for Rome, that a Roman emperor, captured by a foreign king. Reliefs carved into Iranian rock walls still show the moment of victory. The Persian king standing proudly while the defeated Roman emperor kneels before him. But the struggle continued, year after year, generation after generation, until both empires began slowly exhausting themselves. By the early 7th century, the conflict had reached a devastating scale. Massive armies marched across the Middle East. Cities were destroyed. Economies were drained. Both sides pushed their resources to the limit. At one point, the Sasanians captured enormous territories including Egypt, Syria, and even parts of Anatolia. For a moment, it looked like the Persian Empire might finally defeat Byzantium completely. But the Byzantines fought back under a brilliant emperor named Heraclius. He launched daring campaigns deep into Persian territory, eventually forcing the Sasanians into retreat. After decades of brutal warfare, both empires were left bleeding and exhausted, their armies depleted, their treasuries empty, their populations tired of endless war. And at exactly that moment, a new force appeared on the horizon, a force neither empire had taken seriously at first. It came from the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. A new religious movement had united the Arab tribes under a single banner, and its followers believed they were carrying the message of the one true God. Within just a few decades, this new force would shatter both of the ancient superpowers that had dominated the Middle East for centuries. The Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire. The Arab armies were coming. And in the next part of our story, we will witness the fall of the Sasanian Empire in the moment when Iran faced one of the greatest existential crises in its entire 5,000-year history, by the early 7th century. The world of the ancient Middle East had been shaped for generations by the rivalry between two colossal empires. To the west stood the Byzantine Empire. The surviving eastern half of Rome. To the east stood the Sasanian Empire, the last great imperial dynasty of ancient Persia. For nearly 400 years, these two powers had fought each other relentlessly. They battled for control of Mesopotamia. They fought over Armenia and the Caucasus. They invaded each other's territories again and again. And by the time the final war between them ended, both empires were exhausted. Their armies were depleted. Their economies were strained. Their populations were tired of endless conflict. But history rarely leaves power vacuums empty. Because while the two great empires were bleeding each other dry, a dramatic transformation was taking place in the deserts to the south. For centuries, the Arabian Peninsula had been a land of scattered tribes, nomadic groups competing for survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They had rarely played a major role in world politics. But in the early 7th century, something extraordinary happened that a man named Muhammad began preaching a new religious message in the city of Mecca. His teachings united many of the Arab tribes under a single belief system: Islam. After Muhammad's death in 632, the newly united Arab world did something almost unimaginable. It exploded outward. Arab armies began expanding in every direction. First, the great empires of the region did not take them seriously. Why would they? Compared to the massive forces of Byzantium and Persia, the early Muslim armies were small, but they possessed something incredibly powerful: unity, faith, and the momentum of a rapidly growing movement. When Arab forces first clashed with the exhausted armies of the Sasanians, the results shocked everyone. Battle after battle ended in unexpected defeats for the Persian forces. One of the most decisive confrontations came at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah around 636 AD. There, Arab armies faced the main Sasanian forces defending Mesopotamia. Fighting was fierce. Elephants thundered across the battlefield as part of the Persian army. Infantry formations clashed in brutal hand-to-hand combat. But once again, the weakened Sasanian states struggled to maintain coordination. Their leadership was unstable. Internal political struggles had already weakened the empire, and the Arab armies kept pressing forward. When the battle finally ended, the Persian defense had collapsed. The road to the imperial capital lay open. One by one, the great cities of the Sasanian Empire fell. Eventually, the Persian capital itself was captured. The empire that had dominated the Middle East for 4 centuries began disintegrating. The last Sasanian king, Yazdijerd III, fled eastward trying to gather support for resistance. But the empire was already unraveling. Nobles abandoned him. Cities surrendered. Finally, in 651 AD, Yazdijerd was murdered while still on the run. With his death, the Sasanian Empire officially ended. For the first time in over 1,000 years, Iran was no longer ruled by a native imperial dynasty. The land became part of the rapidly expanding Arab Caliphate. A new era had begun, and with the new rulers came something else: a new religion, Islam. For centuries before this moment, the cultural heart of Iran had been shaped by Zoroastrianism. Fire temples had burned across the land. Priests had guided religious life. The philosophy of light battling darkness had influenced Iranian identity for generations. But now Islam began spreading throughout the region. Arabic became the language of administration and religious scholarship. Zoroastrian institutions gradually weakened. Some people converted quickly. Others held onto their older beliefs for generations. The transformation was slow, but over time it reshaped the religious landscape of the country. And for many observers, it looked like Persian identity might finally disappear, because similar things had already happened elsewhere. Look at Egypt. After the Arab conquest, Egyptian culture eventually became largely Arabaized. The ancient Egyptian language faded away. The old traditions gradually disappeared. Or look at Syria and Mesopotamia. Ancient cultures that had once dominated the world slowly merged into the Arabic-speaking Islamic civilization. Many historians expected the same thing to happen in Iran, but something very different occurred. Once again, The strange survival mechanism of Iranian civilization activated. First, the Arabs ruled the land as conquerors. Persians were treated as second-class subjects within the empire. Arab elites dominated political power. But as time passed, the conquerors began encountering something they could not easily replace: the deep cultural sophistication of Iranian society. Persian administrators, Persian scholars, Persian poets, Persian bureaucrats. The Arab rulers needed people who knew how to govern a complex empire, and many of the most skilled administrators available were Persians. Gradually, the Islamic Caliphate began relying heavily on them, especially during the rule of the Abbasid Caliphate, which replaced the earlier Umayyad dynasty. The Abbasid court itself became deeply influenced by Persian traditions. Persian styles of administration spread throughout the Caliphate. Persian scholars contributed to the scientific and philosophical achievements of the Islamic Golden Age. But perhaps the most important survival was something even more fundamental: the Persian language. Even though Arabic dominated religion and scholarship, Persian did not disappear. Instead, it evolved out a new form of the language. New Persian emerged, written using the Arabic script, but preserving its own vocabulary, grammar, and cultural identity. And through this language, Persian culture flourished again. Some of the greatest works of poetry in human history were written in Persian. Stories, epic literature, philosophy, science. Persian intellectual life continued shaping the broader Islamic world, which meant something remarkable had happened. Iran had been conquered militarily, but culturally, it had begun influencing its conquerors. Exactly the pattern that had repeated for thousands of years. The invaders arrived, but eventually they began adopting elements of the civilization they ruled. Yet Iran was not done facing disasters, because in the early 13th century, a new catastrophe would arrive, a force far more destructive than anything before it, a storm of warriors from the Eurasian steppe. An army that destroyed entire cities and wiped civilizations off the map. The Mongols, led by one of the most terrifying conquerors in human history, Genghis Khan. And in the next part of our story, we will see how the Mongol invasion nearly erased Iran completely, and how, unbelievably, even the Mongols themselves would eventually be transformed by Persian civilization. In the early 13th century, the world had already seen countless conquerors. Empires had risen and fallen. Cities had burned. Kingdoms had vanished. But nothing in history had prepared the world for what was coming out of the vast grasslands of Central Asia, but a storm of horsemen, that a force so fast, so brutal, and so relentless that entire civilizations trembled at the mere rumor of their approach. They were the Mongols, and their leader was a man who would become one of the most feared figures in human history, Genghis Khan. Born as Temujin around 1162, he had grown up in hardship among the nomadic tribes of the steppe. Life there was unforgiving. Food could be scarce. Winters were brutal. Tribal wars were constant. Only the strongest survived. But Temujin possessed something rare, an extraordinary ability to unite people. Over the years, he defeated rival tribes one by one. Some he conquered. Others he persuaded to join him. Slowly, the scattered Mongol clans became a single unstoppable force. In 1206, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. And almost immediately, the Mongol armies began expanding outward. Their warfare was unlike anything the settled civilizations had ever faced. Mongol warriors were master horsemen. They could ride for days without stopping. They could shoot arrows with terrifying accuracy while galloping at full speed. Their armies moved faster than any traditional force, and their strategy relied heavily on fear. Cities that surrendered were often spared, but those that resisted were destroyed completely. News of massacres spread rapidly across Asia. Entire populations were wiped out. It was psychological warfare on a scale the world had never seen. And eventually, the Mongol storm reached the lands of Iran. That time, Iran was ruled by the Khwarezmian Empire, a powerful state controlling large territories across Central Asia and Persia. First, Genghis Khan had not intended to invade them. In fact, he had sent merchants and diplomats to establish trade relations. But something went terribly wrong today. Khwarezmian governor accused the Mongol merchants of spying and had them executed. Then the Shah of the empire made an even worse mistake that he executed the Mongol envoys sent to protest that it was a catastrophic insult. In-step culture. Killing ambassadors was an unforgivable crime. Genghis Khan responded with absolute fury. What followed was one of the most devastating invasions in human history. Beginning around 1219, Mongol armies poured into the Khwarezmian Empire. City after city fell. Some tried to resist, others surrendered, but many still suffered terrible destruction. Great centers of civilization were reduced to ruins. Libraries burned. Irrigation systems destroyed. Entire populations massacred. Cities like Nishapur, Merv, and Bokhara experienced unimaginable devastation. The scale of destruction shocked even later historians. Some chroniclers claimed millions were killed during the campaign. While numbers may be exaggerated, there is no doubt that the invasion caused one of the greatest humanitarian catastrophes of the medieval world. Iran, once again, stood on the edge of collapse. Centuries of culture, learning, art, trade, all seemed in danger of disappearing. By 1221, the Khwarezmian Empire had completely disintegrated. The Shah fled across deserts and islands before dying in exile, and the Mongols now controlled vast territories stretching deep into Persian lands. But strangely, history began repeating one of its most fascinating patterns, because while the Mongols were devastating conquerors, they were not builders of sophisticated civilizations. They were steppe nomads ruling over ancient urban societies, and slowly, the influence of those societies began changing them. That a few decades later, another Mongol ruler would arrive in Iran, that a grandson of Genghis Khan, that a man named Hulagu Khan. His campaigns would reshape the Middle East once again, that he would destroy one of the most famous cities in the Islamic world, Baghdad. The fall of Baghdad in 1258 would shock the entire world. But something unexpected would happen afterward. Instead of remaining foreign conquerors forever, the Mongol rulers of Iran would begin adopting Persian culture, Persian administration, and eventually even Islam itself. The conquerors would slowly become part of the civilization they once tried to destroy, and from that transformation, a new Persian cultural revival would emerge. But before that rebirth could happen, the Mongol invasions still had one more wave of destruction to unleash, because another conqueror would rise from the steppe, a warrior who dreamed of rebuilding the Mongol Empire, a man both feared and admired across Asia. His name was Timur, and his campaigns would bring Iran face to face with devastation once again. Yet somehow, through every invasion, every collapse, every catastrophe, the story of Iran continued. And in the next part, we will see how Persian civilization survived even the Mongols, and eventually helped shape some of the greatest empires of the early modern world. The late 14th century, Iran had already endured centuries of conquest, invasion, and devastation. The Mongol invasions had torn through the land like a relentless wind, leaving cities in ruins and rivers of blood behind. Yet, even in the chaos, Persian culture refused to die. Scholars, poets, and artisans kept traditions alive in the midst of destruction. Persian language, administration, and art survived where other civilizations might have vanished entirely. But history, it seemed, was not done testing Iran. From the eastern deserts rose another conqueror, even more notorious than many before him. His name was Timur, often known as Tamerlane in the West. Timur, born in 1336 in the city of Shahri-Sabz in modern-day Uzbekistan, Timur inherited the legacy of the Mongols. But unlike them, he was not content with only conquering steppe lands. He dreamed of creating a vast empire stretching from the Mediterranean to India in 1380. Timur began his campaigns into Iran. His army swept across cities with unparalleled brutality. Pyramids of human skulls were erected as warnings to those who dared resist. Cities like Isfahan, Tabriz, and Herat suffered unimaginable devastation. Farmers fled, trade routes collapsed, and the social fabric of Iran seemed on the brink of annihilation. Yet even in this destruction, something remarkable occurred. Timur, like the Mongols before him, became fascinated by Persian culture. He recognized its sophistication, its traditions, and the deep talent of its artisans. Wherever he could, he brought Persian architects, painters, and poets back to his courts. The cities of his empire, especially Samarkand, became centers of Persian art, learning, and miniature painting. From the ashes of war, a Persian renaissance began to emerge. Timurid Iran became a crucible of culture. Scholars translated ancient texts. Poets wrote masterpieces that would inspire generations. Miniature painting reached heights of beauty that rivaled anything in Europe. Persian architecture blended with the Mongol and Timurid vision, creating monuments of incredible design. What is striking is the pattern. Again and again, conquerors came. Armies destroyed cities. Kings died on battlefields. Yet within a generation or two, these very conquerors began becoming Persian in thought, culture, and administration. The Iranian world had a gravitational pull so strong that even nomadic conquerors could not resist it. Be why the early 16th century, after decades of instability and foreign domination, Iran finally saw the rise of a native dynasty determined to unify the country and solidify its identity once and for all. From the southwestern province of Fars, a man named Shah Ismail I emerged. He would found the Safavid dynasty. The Safavids would achieve something unprecedented. They reunited the fragmented Iranian lands. They established a centralized state with strong governance. Most importantly, they declared Shia Islam as the official state religion, separating Iran from the predominantly Sunni Islamic world, including the powerful Ottoman Empire. Under the Safavids, Iran regained a strong, cohesive identity. Persian culture, language, and religion became intertwined with governance and society in ways that ensured survival and continuity for centuries. For the first time in over 1,000 years, Iran was no longer merely surviving under conquerors. It had become a powerful, independent civilization once more, capable of shaping its destiny instead of merely reacting to the ambitions of outsiders. And yet, the challenges were far from over. Over the next few centuries, Iran would face new threats. Invasions from the north by the Russians, pressures from the British and other colonial powers, and internal political turbulence that would threaten the nation's stability. But through all these challenges, one principle remained constant: the resilience of Persian identity. Time and again, Iran had endured defeat, survived conquest, and absorbed the culture of its invaders, turning potential destruction into a rebirth. In the next part of our story, we will see how modern Iran emerges from centuries of turmoil, how the nation reclaims its ancient name, and how the legacies of all these millennia continue to shape the country today. After centuries of conquests, invasions, and dynastic upheavals, Iran entered the modern era in the 19th century, facing unprecedented challenges. The mighty Safavid Empire had long since fallen. The Qajar dynasty struggled to maintain authority, and foreign powers circled like vultures over Persian lands. The country was losing territories. Following wars with the Russian Empire, Iran permanently lost Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Trade was disrupted, borders were contested, and by the early 20th century, the nation had become a chessboard for imperial ambitions. The British controlled oil-rich regions, while the Russians maintained a heavy military presence in the north. Even the idea of a communist republic was attempted in northern Iran by Soviet influence. The nation was suffocating under layers of foreign pressure, yet once again, Iran refused to disappear. In 1925, a transformative figure emerged: Reza Shah Pahlavi. Reza Shah Pahlavi, he came to power through a military coup, determined to modernize and industrialize Iran. But Reza Shah understood something deeper than politics or economics. He understood identity. For centuries, the West had called this nation Persia, a name associated in Europe with carpets, fairy tales, and exoticism. To the world, Persia was a storybook empire, not a modern nation. In 1935, Reza Shah issued a directive to the global community. From now on, the country must be called Iran, its ancient name, meaning land of the Aryans. This was more than a renaming. It was a statement. We are not merely a romantic relic. We are a civilization 5 millennia strong, powerful, and unbroken. The 20th century brought further turbulence. Iran became a focal point in global geopolitics during World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, caught between the interests of superpowers. Foreign interventions, coups, and political pressure threatened to fracture the country again. Yet, through each crisis, Iran demonstrated its ancient resilience, the same survival mechanism that had helped it endure Alexander, Arabs, Mongols, and Timur. Then came the Islamic Revolution of 1979, one of the most dramatic transformations in modern history. The monarchy fell. Iran became a theocratic republic. Western alliances were severed. New ideologies reshaped governance and society. And once again, Iran faced a choice: to surrender to external pressures or to forge its unique path. Today, Iran exists in a remarkable paradox. In the minds of many outside observers, the word Iran evokes tension, sanctions, political conflicts, and international scrutiny. Yet the word Persia still lingers in global imagination as a land of poetry, art, grand civilizations, and epic histories. Two names, one land, and a continuous struggle over identity and legacy. What makes Iran unique is not just survival, it's adaptation and absorption. Every invader, from the Macedonians to the Arabs, Mongols, and Timurids, was eventually influenced by Persian culture, governance, and thought. Iran did not just endure. It reshaped history, contributed to the concept of linear time, and influenced religions, philosophy, and civilization itself. From the Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons of ancient times to the Aryan tribes, the Elamites, the Medes, the Achaemenids, the Parthians, the Sassanids, and the Safavids. Iran's story is a story of continuity, resilience, and extraordinary cultural gravity. And so, after 5,000 years of war, conquest, rebirth, and reinvention, Iran stands not as a relic of the past, but as a living testament to what a civilization can endure and achieve. Its identity has been challenged again and again, yet it has absorbed every challenge, reshaped every invader, and survived every catastrophe. Iran is not merely a country on a map. It is the embodiment of time itself, the persistence of culture, and the unyielding spirit of a people who learned how to lose battles in order to win eternity. And perhaps, in understanding Iran, we understand something far greater about human history: that the true measure of a civilization is not how often it triumphs in battle, but how deeply it survives, transforms, and leaves its mark on the world.